The Arizona sun is a merciless god, and for Annalise Mayfield alone on her homestead, miles from anywhere, it was her only constant companion. Then she found him, a whisper of life in a broken body, clad in the buckskin of an Apache warrior. To help him was to invite a death sentence upon herself. The territory was screaming for Apache blood. To leave him was to abandon the last piece of her own humanity. She chose to risk everything for a man who wouldn't or couldn't speak a single word. She had no idea that his eventual silence, and the one sentence that would finally break it, would shatter her world and redefine the meaning of survival. The heat of the Arizona territory in late August was a physical weight. It pressed down on the cracked earth, shimmered above the sparse greasewood, and baked the very soul of anyone foolish enough to be caught in its midday glare. For Annalise Mayfield, it was the price of solitude, a price she paid willingly. Her small defensible adobe homestead, with its single well and patch of stubborn corn, was a fortress against a past she had fled from Philadelphia, a world of suffocating corsets, arranged marriages, and the hollow eyes of a society that saw her as little more than a porcelain doll to be bartered. Here the dangers were different. They were honest. Rattlesnakes gave a warning. The sun announced its intentions with a blistering dawn. The Chiricahua Apache, the U.S. Army cavalry from Fort Bowie, and the hard-bitten prospectors that drifted through the dragoons were all predictable in their own violent ways. Annalise, with her late father's Winchester Model 1873 leaning by the door and a resolve forged in defiance, had learned the rhythms of this harsh land. On this day, the rhythm was broken. Her horse, a sturdy buckskin named Patches, had thrown a shoe. Annalise was walking the dry creek bed back to her homestead, the 2 miles feeling like 20 when the vultures gave her the first sign. They wheeled in a lazy, patient spiral, their dark shapes stark against the bleached blue sky. Her hand instinctively went to the Colt Peacemaker, holstered at her hip. Vultures meant death, and death in this land was rarely peaceful. She followed the creek's bend, her boots scuffing quietly on the gravel. The scent hit her next, the coppery tang of blood, sharp and metallic under the dust and creosote. And then she saw him. He was wedged between 2 rust-colored boulders almost invisible. He wasn't a prospector or a cowboy. He wore the breechcloth and worn leather moccasins of an Apache. His skin, the color of rich earth, was slick with a mixture of sweat and drying blood. A gruesome, ragged wound marred his side, a dark plum blossom of torn flesh that looked like a cavalry saber's brutal work. Another gash on his forehead had bled profusely, matting his long black hair. He was terrifyingly still. Annalise's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of pure primal fear. Every story she'd ever heard screamed at her to run. The newspapers in Tombstone, the gossip at the general store in Tres Alamos, they all painted the same picture. The Apache were ghosts, demons of the desert, butchers of women and children. The name Geronimo was whispered like a curse. This man lying broken before her was the embodiment of that terror. She raised the Colt, the hammer, clicking back with an obscene loudness in the dead quiet. Her finger tightened on the trigger. It would be a mercy for him ending his suffering, a mercy for her ending the threat. The cavalry would probably give her a medal. The local ranchers, like the powerful and unforgiving Elias Thorne, whose brother had been killed in a raid last spring, would call her a hero. But her finger wouldn't move. She lowered the pistol, her breath catching in her throat. She saw not the demon of the stories, but a man. His face, though smeared with grime, and blood was etched with strong lines. A high brow, a straight nose, a jaw that spoke of an iron will. His chest rose and fell in the shallowest of breaths, a flicker of life, so faint it might have been a trick of the heat. Compassion and emotion she thought this land had burned out of her, warred with her survival instinct. To bring him back to her homestead was an act of madness. If he were found, she would be branded a traitor, an Indian lover. Thorne and his ranch hands would likely burn her out, and the law would look the other way. If the man himself woke up, what then? Would he repay her kindness with a knife in the dark? She stood there for a long time, the sun beating down on her, the vultures continuing their patient vigil. The world presented her with two choices: leave him to die, and be safe, or help him and risk everything. The woman who had fled Philadelphia had done so because she refused to let others dictate her life. She had chosen freedom with all its attendant dangers. What was that freedom worth if at the first true test she chose the coward's path, with a curse that would have scandalized her mother? Annalise holstered her pistol. The decision once made settled in her with a grim certainty. She knelt beside him, her practical mind taking over. He was too heavy to carry. She would have to come back with the buckboard. She tore a strip from the hem of her petticoat, a garment she despised anyway, and soaked it with water from her canteen. Gently, she wiped the blood from his forehead. His skin was fever-hot. He didn't stir. She dribbled a little water between his cracked lips, most of it running down his chin. "Stay alive," she whispered, the word sounding foreign in the vast silence. It wasn't a plea. It was a command. "You hear me? You just stay alive until I get back." She turned and began the long, hurried walk back to her homestead, leaving the unconscious warrior in the shadow of the rocks. She didn't look back at the circling vultures. She was now in a race against them, and against the unforgiving land itself. She had just invited the most dangerous secret in the Arizona territory into her home, and the silence of the desert seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see what she would do next. The effort it took to get him back to the homestead nearly broke her. She managed to hitch Patches, despite his missing shoe, to the small buckboard and guide it down the treacherous rocky creek bed. Loading him was a nightmare of dead weight, grunting exertion, and the sickening warm stickiness of his reopened wounds. Annalise, drenched in sweat and his blood, finally hauled him onto the wooden planks and covered him with a dusty canvas tarp, praying no one would ride by and ask what she was transporting. Back in the cool, dim interior of her adobe home, the reality of her decision settled in. She dragged him onto the spare cot in the corner of the main room, a space that now felt charged with a dangerous energy. For the first 2 days, he was a ghost, hovering between the world of the living and the world of the dead. He was consumed by a raging fever that left him shivering and muttering in a language she didn't understand, guttural raw sounds of pain and delirium. Annalise became a creature of pure function. She stripped him of his breechcloth, her face burning with a mixture of clinical necessity and a strange forbidden intimacy as she cleaned his powerful scarred body. The saber wound in his side was deep and jagged. She did what her father, a doctor before he'd been consumed by wanderlust, had taught her. She boiled water, cleaned the wound with whiskey until he arched in unconscious agony and stitched it closed with a needle and gut her hands, surprisingly steady. She packed it with a poultice of crushed yarrow and comfrey from her small herb garden, remedies the locals scoffed at, but which she trusted more than any town doctor. She forced broth and water between his lips. She bathed his burning forehead with cool cloths. She sat with the Winchester across her lap through the long, silent nights, listening to the coyotes howl and the sound of his ragged breathing. She was a warden and a nurse, his captor and his saviour. During those long hours she found herself talking to him. It was a one-sided conversation, a confession whispered into the void. She told him about Philadelphia, about the stifling expectations, and the man her family had chosen for her, a banker named Richard Sterling, whose hands were always clammy and whose eyes held the predatory gleam of ownership. She told him about her escape, using the inheritance from her mother to buy this small, forgotten piece of land, and disappear. "They thought a woman couldn't survive out here alone," she murmured one night, changing the dressing on his side. "They thought I'd come running back within a month, begging for Richard's protection. They don't know, you see. They don't understand that some prisons have walls you can't see." She looked at his still face. "I wonder what kind of prison you were running from." On the third day, the fever broke. Annalise woke from a light doze in her chair to find him watching her. His eyes were open. They were the darkest eyes she had ever seen, black and profound, and they held an intelligence that was sharp and utterly unnerving. There was no delirium in them now, just a calm, assessing watchfulness. He said nothing. The silence that followed was different from the silence of his unconsciousness. It was heavier, a living thing that filled the small room. He watched her every move as she brought him water, as she prepared her own simple meal of beans and corn bread, as she mended a shirt by the light of the fire. His gaze was impenetrable. It wasn't hostile, not exactly, but it wasn't friendly either. It was the gaze of a wild thing, cornered and calculating. Days bled into a week. His strength slowly returned. He began to eat the broth, and then the soft cooked beans she offered, taking the bowl from her with a steady hand. He would sit up on the cot, his bare back, straight the dark line of his stitched wound, a stark contrast to his skin. And still, he said nothing. Not a word. Not a grunt of thanks. Nothing. The silence began to fray Annalise's nerves. The man she had imagined in his delirium was replaced by this silent, observant stranger. Who was he? Was he grateful? Was he plotting to kill her the moment her back was turned? Her fear, which had been overshadowed by the urgency of saving his life, began to creep back in. The outside world intruded on the fifth day in the form of Reverend Michael Miller, a traveling preacher who made his rounds through the outlying homesteads every few months. Annalise saw the dust from his mule-drawn cart from her window, and her blood ran cold. "Annalise, sister! Annalise, are you home?" He called out, his voice a reedy tenor. Panic seized her. Before she could think, she turned to the Apache. Her eyes were wide with fear. She pointed to the small root cellar, its door a heavy plank set in the floor. In there. Now. Quickly. His eyes flickered from her face to the door, then back again. For a moment she thought he would refuse. Then, with a fluid grace that belied his injuries, he slid off the cot, moved across the floor without a sound, and lowered himself into the dark space. She slammed the door shut, just as the Reverend's knock sounded on her main door. She plastered a smile on her face, her heart trying to beat its way out of her chest. "Reverend Miller, what a surprise. Just checking on my flock," he said, his watery blue eyes scanning the interior of her home. He was a small, fussy man, prone to gossip, disguised as Christian concern. "You look flushed, my child. The heat not getting to you. Just been working in the garden, Reverend." She lied, her hands clenched behind her back. "Can I offer you some water?" He accepted, and as he drank, his eyes roamed. They fell on the cot. "Expecting company? I didn't think you had many visitors out this way." "Oh, that," Annalise said, her mind racing. I've been airing out some blankets. The dust, you know." His gaze lingered on the bowl and spoon sitting on the small crate next to the cot. It was the one the Apache had just used. Annalise's stomach turned to ice. She saw the flicker of suspicion in his eyes, the way his lips pursed. He was a man who thrived on spotting the sins of others. Indeed, he said slowly. Well, I won't keep you. Just remember the Lord sees all, Sister Annalise, even here in the wilderness. He sees the secrets we keep in the dark places of our homes and our hearts. The words hung in the air like a threat. After he left, Annalise stood trembling for a full minute before she opened the cellar door. The Apache man emerged, his face as unreadable as ever. But as he looked at her pale face and shaking hands, she thought she saw something shift in his dark eyes, a flicker of understanding. He went back to his cot. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was shared. They had a secret, a dangerous one, and the world was starting to press in on them. The preacher's visit had been a warning. The fragile peace of her homestead had been irrevocably shattered. 2 more days passed in that thick, watchful silence. The Apache man was healing at a remarkable rate. The grim line of her stitches on his side was clean, and he was moving with more ease, his inherent strength reasserting itself. He would stand at the window for long periods, staring out at the vast, empty landscape, his posture betraying a deep, aching restlessness. Annalise found herself watching him, a knot of anxiety, and a strange, unfamiliar curiosity tightening in her stomach. The mystery of him was a palpable force in her small home. On the evening of the 9th day, since she'd found him, the tension finally broke. Annalise was cleaning her father's rifle, the familiar scent of gun oil and the rhythmic slide of the cleaning rod a small comfort. The man had been watching her from the cot, his dark eyes tracing her movements. She had finished her task and was about to put the rifle away when she felt his gaze intensify. She looked up, and for the first time, his expression was not one of mere observation. There was something else there, a depth of emotion that made her breath catch. His voice, when it came, was low and raspy from disuse, the words halting, as if he were pulling them from a great depth. "You're the reason I lived." The 3 words struck Annalise with the force of a physical blow. They were in English, clear and deliberate. All the fear, the resentment, the exhaustion of the past week dissolved in that single stunning sentence. She stared at him, speechless. He gestured with his chin toward the rifle. Most would have used that, or left me for the vultures. Why, Annalise leaned the Winchester against the wall, her hands feeling unsteady. I don't know," she answered honestly, her voice barely a whisper. Leaving you to die seemed wrong. Wrong for a White Eyes to leave an Apache to die. A faint, cynical smile touched his lips. The soldiers from the fort would not think so. The rancher Thorne, he would not think so. He knew of Elias Thorne. The knowledge sent a chill down her spine. "What is your name?" she asked, changing the subject. He hesitated for a long moment, his eyes searching her face, as if trying to read her very soul. "My people call me Kyle," he said finally. "It means one who walks alone." Kyle, she repeated. The name felt solid, real. The silent stranger in her home finally had an identity. "I am Annalise Mayfield." "Annalise," he said her name, slowly tasting the syllables. "It is a soft name. For a woman with a hard spirit." A fragile bridge had been built between them with those few words. Over the next few days it was strengthened, piece by piece. His English was limited, but functional. Learned, he explained from a trader who had frequented his band years ago, before the final bitter wars had begun under the leadership of men like Cochise and now Geronimo. He began to talk not in a flood, but in short declarative statements, answering her hesitant questions. He was Chiricahua of the Bedonkohe band. They had been raiding a supply wagon train bound for Fort Bowie when they were ambushed by a much larger cavalry patrol. He'd been shot from his horse, then run through with a saber and left for dead. His war party was scattered or killed. He had been trying to make his way back to his people's stronghold in the Sierra Madre when he collapsed in the creek bed. In turn, Annalise found herself sharing more about her own life, filling in the details she had only whispered when he was unconscious. She spoke of the oppressive greenness of Pennsylvania, so different from the stark, honest beauty of the desert. She described the cold calculation in Richard Sterling's eyes and the suffocating feeling of being a beautiful bird in a gilded cage. "I came here to be free," she told him one evening as they shared a meal of roasted rabbit. "To breathe." Kyle looked at her, his gaze thoughtful. "Your people see freedom in owning land. A piece of paper that says, 'This dirt is yours.' My people see freedom in the land itself, to move with the seasons, to follow the deer, to not be owned by a place." It was a profound difference, one that highlighted the immense chasm between their worlds. Yet in that small adobe house they found common ground. He showed her how to read the subtle signs of the desert, the way a bent twig could tell of a passing deer, how the call of a specific bird could signal the presence of a snake. He had a quiet, dry wit that occasionally surfaced, surprising a laugh out of her. She in turn read to him from the one book she'd brought with her, a worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets. He didn't understand all the words, but he listened intently to the rhythm and the emotion in her voice. "He speaks of love like it is a sickness," Cale observed after she read, "My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. A fever. Some would say it is." Annalise replied, her face warm. An intimacy was growing between them that had nothing to do with the physical and everything to do with the stripping away of pretenses. He had seen her at her most frightened and most capable. She had seen him at his most vulnerable. There were no societal rules to govern their interactions, no prying eyes to judge them. There was only the man and the woman, the heat and the silence, and the shared danger that lurked just outside their door. One afternoon, he was examining the intricate stitches she had made in his side. He traced the line of the scar gently with his fingertip. "You have the hands of a healer," he said, his voice low. "My father was a doctor," she said. "He taught you well." His dark eyes lifted to meet hers, and the air in the room grew thick, charged with an unspoken current. It was a look of profound gratitude, but there was something deeper, something more personal and magnetic that pulled at her. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. The trust between them was becoming a fragile, beautiful thing, but they both knew it was a trust that existed only within the mud-brick walls of her home. Outside, the world was full of men like Reverend Miller and Elias Thorne. Outside, he was the enemy, and she was the woman who harbored him. And the outside world could not be kept at bay forever. The fragile peace within the adobe walls was built on borrowed time, and the debt was about to be called in. The name Cale had mentioned, Elias Thorne, was more than just a name to Annalise. He was a powerful presence in the region, the owner of the sprawling T-Bar ranch that encompassed nearly all the good grazing land south of the Dragoon Mountains. Thorne was a man carved from the same hard rock as the territory itself, weathered, unyielding and brutal when necessary. Since his younger brother William had been killed during an Apache raid on a cattle drive the previous spring, Thorne's already simmering dislike for the native people had boiled over into a white-hot, obsessive hatred. He paid high bounties for Apache scalps, no questions asked, and his ranch hands, a rough collection of ex-soldiers, gunslingers and men running from the law were more of a private army than a group of cowboys. Annalise had met him twice. Once in town, where his cold, assessing eyes had swept over her with an unnerving possessiveness, and once when he'd ridden out to her homestead, ostensibly to warn the lone woman about the Apache threat, though it felt more like an act of marking his territory. About 2 weeks after Cale had first spoken, Annalise saw a rider approaching. It wasn't the slow, ambling pace of Reverend Miller's mule. This was a powerful horse, eating up the ground, with long, purposeful strides. Her heart leaped into her throat. "It is Thorne," Cale said from the window. His voice was flat, but his body was coiled like a spring. He had already retrieved the knife he kept sheathed in his moccasin, a blade Annalise had cleaned and sharpened for him, the cellar she hissed, her mind racing. There was no time to hide the extra cot or the signs of a second person. Kyle moved with silent speed, disappearing into the dark space, just as Thorne reined his magnificent black stallion to a halt outside. Annalise took a deep breath, smoothed her apron, and stepped out into the blinding sunlight shielding her eyes. "Mr. Thorne," she said, forcing a calm she did not feel. "What brings you so far out?" Elias Thorne swung down from his saddle. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with a sun-scorched face and pale blue eyes that seemed to absorb all the light around them. He held the reins in his hand, his thumb hooked into a gun belt that was tied low on his hip. He looked like a predator that was comfortable in its own skin. "Miss Mayfield," he drawled, his lips curving into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just making the rounds. There's been talk. Apaches on the move again. A small band hit a prospector's camp up near the Chiricahuas." "I've seen no one," Annalise said, her voice tight. Thorne's gaze swept over her homestead, missing nothing. "You're a brave woman staying out here alone. Or a foolish one." He took a step closer, his shadow falling over her. "I could offer you my protection. A woman like you shouldn't be without a man to look after her. I look after myself just fine, Mr. Thorne." His smile tightened. "So I see." His eyes drifted past her, into the open doorway of her home. "May I have some water for my horse? It's a long ride back." It was a test, a way to get inside. She couldn't refuse without arousing suspicion. Of course. She turned and led the way to the trough by the well, her back prickling, intensely aware of him following her. As the horse drank, Thorne walked casually toward her front door and peered inside. Annalise's heart pounded. "Getting a little crowded in there, aren't you, Miss Mayfield?" he asked, his voice deceptively light. She followed his gaze. He was looking directly at Cale's cot. "As I told the Reverend, I was airing out blankets," she said, her throat dry. Thorne stepped inside his boots, loud on the packed earth floor. He walked over to the cot and ran a hand over the simple wool blanket. Then he bent down and picked something up from the floor. He held it up between his thumb and forefinger. It was a single, long strand of black hair. It was unmistakably Cale's. "This is a mighty coarse hair for a woman of your fine breeding, Miss Mayfield," Thorne said softly, his pale eyes pinning her in place. "And it's a bit too long for any of the cowboys I know." Annalise's blood ran cold. She was caught. The lie was flimsy, transparent, and he saw right through it. "I don't know what you're talking about." She stammered, her mind a blank wall of panic. Thorne let the hair drop. He took a slow walk around the small room, his gaze lingering on the extra bowl, the scuff marks near the cellar door she hadn't had time to erase. He was like a hound on a scent, and the scent of his prey was thick in the air. He stopped in front of her, his height and bulk dominating the space. "There are rumors in town," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Reverend Miller speaks of secrets." He says he felt a darkness in this house, a godless presence. He leaned closer, his breath smelling of whiskey and dust. I'm a man who respects God, Miss Mayfield, but I also believe in dealing with the devil when you find him hiding in your neighbor's cellar. He knew. He didn't know for sure, but his suspicion was so strong it was a certainty. He straightened up and walked to the door, turning back to face her from the threshold. The sunlight framed him, making him a dark, menacing silhouette. My brother William was a good man. He said, his voice, now raw, with a carefully controlled rage. He was kind. He was going to be married. The Apache who killed him. They didn't just kill him. They tortured him. I found what was left of him, myself. He paused, letting the horrific image hang in the air between them. If I find out that you are harboring one of those red-skinned butchers, Miss Mayfield, he continued, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet, I will burn this house to the ground, with you and him inside of it. And the law will call it a tragic accident. Do you understand me? Annalise could only nod her throat too tight to speak. He gave her one last long look, a look that promised violence, and then he swung onto his horse and rode away, not looking back. Annalise collapsed against the doorframe, her legs giving way. The illusion of safety was gone, replaced by the chilling certainty of Thorne's vengeance. When she finally found the strength to open the cellar door, Kyle emerged. His face was a mask of stone, but his eyes were blazing with a cold fire. He had heard everything. You must go, she whispered, her voice trembling. Tonight. He'll be back. He will not be looking for one man, Kyle said, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. He will be looking for two people now. You are in this as deep as I am, Annalise. She looked at him at the fierce resolve in his eyes, and knew he was right. Thorne's threat wasn't just against him, it was against her. They were no longer just a man and a woman from different worlds. They were allies bound together by a shared mortal enemy. The hunt had begun. The setting sun painted the sky in brutal streaks of orange and purple, a beautiful but ominous prelude to the coming night. There was no time for deliberation, no room for regret. Elias Thorne was not a man to make idle threats. Every minute they remained at the homestead was a minute he was likely gathering his men. We have to take what we can carry. Annalise, said her voice, now steady, the initial shock replaced by a cold, clear-headed focus. She was the doctor's daughter again, the pragmatic survivor. Water, food, ammunition. Kyle nodded, his movements, economical and swift. He was already checking her Winchester, his hands moving with an expert familiarity that spoke of a lifetime of conflict. The horse's patches is lame, we can't ride him hard. And he's too slow for Thorne's stallion. Annalise said, her mind working through the terrible logistics. But we can use him for the supplies. We travel on foot, into the dragoons. He will expect that. He will expect us to head for the high ground, Kyle agreed. But he will not know the paths I know. The mountains that are a trap for him can be a sanctuary for us. They worked in a grim, silent tandem. Annalise packed dried meat cornmeal and a small sack of beans into saddlebags. She filled every canteen and water skin she owned. Most importantly, she gathered every box of cartridges she had for the Winchester and her Colt. Kyle, meanwhile, found a small whetstone and put a razor-sharp edge on his knife and on the blade of a small hand axe he found in her shed. He moved with a predator's grace, his senses on high alert, his head cocked to catch the slightest sound from the desert. As twilight bled into true darkness, they loaded the supplies onto the stoic patches. Annalise gave the horse a final affectionate pat on the nose. "You've been a good friend," she whispered. She turned back to her home, the small adobe structure that had been her fortress and her refuge. She looked at her books, her mother's rocking chair, the life she had painstakingly built for herself. Now she was abandoning it all. "There is nothing for you here now," Kyle said gently, as if reading her mind. "It is just a place. Your life is what you carry with you." His words were a comfort and a sharp reminder of their reality. She nodded, took one last look, and turned her back on her home forever. They moved east toward the jagged, shadowy silhouette of the Dragoon Mountains. Kyle led the way with Annalise following close behind, leading patches. Kyle didn't use trails. He moved through the brush and rocks, using the terrain as cover, his steps making almost no sound. For a city woman, Annalise was strong and sure-footed, her determination overriding her exhaustion. They had been traveling for less than an hour when they saw it. A flicker of orange light against the horizon, back in the direction of the homestead. It grew brighter, angrier, a malevolent star blooming in the desert night. Thorne Annalise breathed, her heart clenching in a painful knot. "He's burning it." Kyle stopped and placed a hand on her arm. "Do not look back," he said, his voice firm. "He did not find us. That is his failure. This is our victory. Now we must keep moving." His strength became her own. She tore her eyes away from the destructive glow and pushed forward into the darkness. The image of her burning home seared into her mind. The next few days were a blur of exhaustion, fear, and relentless motion. Kyle was a master of the land. He led them through narrow canyons where their passage would leave no tracks over ridges of sheer rock where horses couldn't follow, and to hidden seeps of water that Annalise never would have found. He taught her to walk on the balls of her feet, to minimize noise, to read the stars for direction, and to understand the profound silence of the night. On the third day, from a high vantage point, they saw them, a group of riders, maybe 10 or 12 men, fanning out across the foothills below. Thorne was at their head, on his black stallion, a relentless searching party. They looked like ants from this distance, but their menace was enormous. "They are cutting us off from the south," Kyle observed, his face grim. "He is smart. He knows this is the way to Mexico. What do we do?" Annalise asked, her mouth dry. "We do what he does not expect," Kyle said. He pointed not south toward the border, but north, deeper into the heart of the Dragoons. "We go toward Cochise Stronghold." Annalise stared at him. Cochise Stronghold was a legendary natural fortress, a place the U.S. Army had never been able to penetrate. It was also hallowed ground for the Chiricahua. "They will kill me if they find me there," she stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "They might," Kyle admitted, his gaze unwavering. "But Thorne will kill us both if he finds us here. With my people you have a chance. With him you have none." Their escape became a desperate, grueling ascent. The terrain grew harsher, the climbs steeper. Patches, the faithful buckskin, began to falter, his lame leg unable to handle the strain. One morning, they found him lying down, his breathing shallow, unable to rise. Annalise knelt by his head, tears finally streaming down her face as she stroked his muzzle. Kyle stood beside her, his expression somber. "He has carried our lives this far. He can go no further." He drew his knife. "No," Annalise said, her voice choked. "Let me." She took out her Colt, her hand heavy. It was the hardest thing she had ever had to do. The single shot echoed through the canyon, a sharp, lonely crack that sounded like a final goodbye to her old life. Now, truly alone, carrying what little they could on their backs, they pushed on. The physical hardship was immense, but a powerful bond was being forged between them in the crucible of the chase. They relied on each other for everything. He found the path and the food root's edible cacti, a small snake he killed and cooked, over a smokeless fire. She rationed the water and tended to their cuts and bruises, her medical knowledge invaluable. One evening, as they huddled for warmth in a shallow cave, Thorne's riders passed so close below them they could hear the jingle of bridles and the low murmur of men's voices. Annalise held her breath, pressing herself against the cold stone, her body rigid with terror. Kyle sat perfectly still beside her, the Winchester laid across his lap, his eyes like chips of obsidian in the darkness. He reached out and covered her hand with his. His touch was warm, steady, and infinitely reassuring. In that moment of shared silent terror, her feelings for him deepened into something far beyond gratitude or alliance. It was a profound, unshakable connection. When the riders had passed and the silence returned, he didn't let go of her hand. The chase had stripped them down to their essential selves, and what was left was a man and a woman who had saved each other in more ways than one. They had escaped Thorne's fire, but a different kind of flame was beginning to burn between them, a warmth in the cold, dangerous stone. The entrance to Koshi's stronghold was not a gate or a pass, but a series of winding, interlocking canyons that seemed designed by nature to confuse and trap any intruder. After days of grueling travel, Kyle led Annalise through a crack in a rock wall, so narrow they had to pass through it sideways. The air immediately changed. It grew cooler, filled with the scent of pine and oak and damp earth. The harsh, sun-blasted landscape gave way to a hidden valley, a green sanctuary of impossible beauty nestled in the heart of the stone fortress. Water trickled down moss-covered rocks into clear pools. Ancient oaks provided a canopy of shade. It was a place of peace, a world away from the desert they had just crossed. But it was not empty. As they emerged into a small clearing, figures seemed to melt out of the rocks and trees around them. They were Chiricahua warriors, their faces grim, their rifles leveled. They were lean, hard men with the same watchful eyes as Kyle. Annalise froze her hand instinctively, going to her pistol. Kyle stepped in front of her, raising a hand in a sign of peace. He spoke to them in the rapid, flowing Apache language. His tone was calm but firm. The warriors' eyes flickered from him to Annalise, their expressions a mixture of suspicion and hostility. A white woman here in their most sacred place, it was an unheard-of sacrilege. One of the warriors, an older man with a face like a topographical map of the surrounding mountains, seemed to be the leader. He and Kyle spoke for a long time. Kyle gestured back the way they had come, describing their flight, his voice imbued with an urgency that transcended the language barrier. He mentioned Thorne's name, and Annalise saw a flicker of recognition, of shared enmity in the old warrior's eyes. Finally, the leader gave a curt nod. The rifles were lowered, but the hostile stares remained. Kyle turned to Annalise. "They will not harm you," he said, his voice low. "I have told them you saved my life, and that Elias Thorne, who has the scalp of this man's cousin, wants you dead as much as he wants me. They see the enemy of their enemy as a temporary friend. We can rest here for a short time." They were led to a small, secluded cave, tucked behind a waterfall. It was dry and sheltered. They were brought food venison and roasted agave hearts and fresh water. The Chiricahua left them alone, but Annalise always felt their eyes on her. She was an alien presence, a ghost from a hostile world, and the peace of the stronghold was a conditional, fragile thing. But in the seclusion of the cave, a different kind of peace descended. For the first time in weeks, they were not running. They were not listening for the sound of approaching riders. The constant grinding fear receded, leaving a vacuum in its place. And into that vacuum rushed all the unspoken emotions that had been building between them. That night, a cool breeze whispered through the canyon. The only sounds were the splash of the waterfall and the crackle of the small fire Kyle had built at the mouth of the cave. They sat side by side, watching the flames wrapped in their own blankets and a shared silence. "I never thought I would see this place again," Kyle said softly, breaking the quiet. "When I was lying in that creek bed, I was singing my death song in my head." "I'm glad you were a poor singer," Annalise replied, a small smile touching her lips. He looked at her, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. The guarded, watchful expression was gone, replaced by a raw vulnerability she had never seen before. "In my fever," he said, his voice dropping lower, "I dreamed of water, and of a woman's cool hands. I think even then, some part of me knew you were there. I held on for that." Annalise's heart ached. She thought of her life before of Richard Sterling's clammy, possessive hands, and compared them to Cale's strong, capable hands that could kill a man or gently steady her own. "You saved my life too, Kyle," she whispered. "Out there. I would have been dead 10 times over without you. We saved each other." He corrected her gently. The space between them crackled with an undeniable energy. It was a pull that had been growing since that first moment he had spoken her name, a current that had run beneath every shared danger, every silent understanding. He shifted closer, and the warmth from his body reached across the small gap. "Annalise," he murmured, and the way he said her name was a caress. He reached out, not with force, but with a hesitant tenderness, and cupped her jaw. His thumb stroked her cheek, a rough, calloused touch that sent a shiver through her entire body. She leaned into his hand, her eyes fluttering shut. All the barriers between them, race culture, a history of violence between their peoples, seemed to dissolve in the simple, profound truth of this one moment. When he kissed her, it was not the rough, demanding kiss of a hardened warrior, but something searching and deeply reverent. It was a kiss that tasted of wood-smoke desperation and a hope she hadn't realized she was missing. She responded with all the pent-up loneliness and fear and burgeoning love she had kept locked away. Her arms went around his neck, and she clung to him, the man who had become her entire world. In the sanctuary of the cave, hidden from the hate of one world and the suspicion of the other, they came together. It was a desperate, beautiful act of defiance. Two people from warring worlds claiming a moment of peace and passion that belonged only to them. But even as they held each other in the aftermath, the cold light of reality began to dawn. This place, this moment, was an illusion. A beautiful, stolen dream. "What happens now?" Cale Annalise asked, her voice muffled against his shoulder. He was silent for a long time. She felt the tension return to his body. "My path is with my people," he said, finally, his voice heavy with a pain that mirrored her own. "Geronimo is gathering the last of the free Chiricahua in Mexico. We will fight until we cannot fight any more. It is a life of running, of battle. It is not a life for you." "And what is my life?" she countered, sitting up. "To go back to where Thorne has burned my home. Even if he dies, I am a pariah, the woman who ran with an Apache. I have no world to go back to." The terrible, painful truth hung between them. He could not live in her world, and she could not survive in his. He was a warrior, bound by duty and heritage to a fading way of life. She was a pioneer, a survivor, but she was not Apache. To stay with him would be to invite death, not just for herself, but for the people who had given her temporary shelter. To leave him felt like tearing out her own heart. Their stolen moment of peace was over. It had been a beautiful, fleeting dream, but the dawn was coming, and with it a choice that seemed to offer no outcome but loss and heartbreak. The safety of the stronghold had given them the space to find each other, but it had also illuminated the impossible chasm that would forever keep them apart. The love that had bloomed in the dark of the cave felt like a liability in the cold light of day. The impossible choice hung between them, heavy and unspoken. Kyle returned from a council with the Chiricahua elder Taza, his face set like stone. "Thorne's men are still searching," he said, his voice low and urgent. "It is not safe for you to leave, but we have a plan." The plan was as dangerous as it was brilliant. Cale and a small war party would ride south, creating a highly visible, desperate flight toward Mexico. They would draw Thorne and all his men into a chase, a trap set on their own terms. While the hunters were occupied, Taza would guide Annalise north to the San Pedro River and the stagecoach town of Fairbanks. From there she could disappear. "It's a suicide mission," Annalise whispered, her heart seizing with fear for him. "It is the only way," Cale said, his gaze unwavering. "For you to have a life, I must lead Thorne to his death. There is no other path." Their final hours together were agonizingly precious. He led her to a high ledge overlooking the stronghold as the sun began to set. "This land keeps a memory of everything that happens on it," Kyle said quietly, his arm around her. "It will remember you, Annalise, the woman with the spirit of a mountain lion and the hands of a healer. And I will remember the man who taught me what it means to be free," she replied, tears blurring the golden landscape. Before he left, he pressed a small beaded amulet with a single blue stone into her hand. "Turquoise," he said, "for protection, so you do not forget the color of the Arizona sky we shared." Their final kiss was a heartbreaking fusion of love and loss. "Live well, Annalise Mayfield," he whispered. Then he was gone, melting into the shadows with the other warriors. Her journey north with Taza was a silent, swift passage through the mountains. When they reached a ridge overlooking the distant town, the old warrior simply nodded at her, a gesture of profound respect, before vanishing back into the wilderness. Annalise walked into Fairbanks a ghost of her former self, selling her mother's gold locket for a bath, a new dress, and a stagecoach ticket. She gave the name Anna Smith. Weeks later in Tucson, a small newspaper article caught her eye. Rancher Elias Thorne and 6 of his men had been found dead in a box canyon near the Mexican border, the victims of a perfectly executed Apache ambush. The article mentioned they had been pursuing the renegades, who allegedly burned the homestead of Annalise Mayfield, who was missing and presumed dead. Kyle had kept his word. He had given her a future. Annalise traveled north, settling in the pine-forested town of Prescott. She opened a small clinic, her quiet strength and healing skills earning her the community's respect. She never married, keeping a part of her heart guarded and private. Some nights she would walk to the edge of town and look south, holding the turquoise amulet in her hand. She never knew if Kyle lived or died, but she knew his legacy was written on the wind, and it lived on in the free and courageous woman she had become. The story of Annalise and Kyle is a testament to a love that defied every boundary of culture, of race, and of war. It's a raw and honest look at the brutal realities of the Old West, where survival was a daily struggle, and choosing compassion was the most dangerous act of all. Theirs wasn't a story that could end with a ride into the sunset, but its power lies in that truth. It's about the indelible mark 2 people can leave on each other's souls, creating a legacy of courage that lasts a lifetime, even when they are worlds apart. If this journey into the heart of the Wild West moved you, please show your support. Hit that like button, share this story with someone who appreciates epic romance and drama, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel for more tales that bring history to life. Don't forget to comment below what part of Annalise and Kael's story will stay with you the most.